Chapter 25. Tiny particles of ash floated on the air. A subdued sense of relief fell upon us, like the blanket of dust that covered the field, as the remains of the destroyed newborns drifted back down to earth. It's over. Thank heavens, Esme thought, as she nestled herself in the safety of Carlyle's embrace. He wrapped his arms protectively around her, and rested his chin on her head, as he breathed his own sigh of relief. I drew Bella closer to me, pressing a kiss to the crown of her head. She gripped my shirt in her hands, burrowing her face in my chest as she fought to control her breathing. My eyes scanned the field, the members of my family standing in pairs, comforting one another, thankful that our family had survived both the battle with the newborns and the encounter with the Volturi intact and relatively unscathed. Bella trembled in my arms, and I squeezed her reassuringly. "We should go," I whispered to her. She gazed up at me, nodding in agreement. I was desperate to take her away from this field, from this place of destruction and death. I looked up, and Carlyle's eyes met mine. "I need to go to Jacob quickly," he thought. "The wolves heal so rapidly. It's likely the fractures have already begun to repair themselves, and I'm afraid they might not set properly." "Let's go home," I whispered to Bella, pulling her into my arms. She wrapped her thin arms around my neck and tucked her head under my chin. "Someone will need to stay behind to clean up," I murmured. "We'll stay," Emmett offered, and Rosalie nodded in agreement. "I'll stay as well," Jasper nodded. Alice leaned into him, concern etching her face. In her thoughts, and in Jasper's, I could see that today's events had affected him much more than the rest of my family. His face was drawn, and he seemed to have aged over the course of the day, wary of the struggle between who he is and who he once was. The battle with the newborns dredged up painful memories that he had long since buried in his subconscious, and now they had risen to the surface, fresh as the wounds on his arm, though exponentially more painful. "Alice," I asked, watching my sister warily, "will you come with us?" She hesitated, glancing between Jasper and myself. She turned to Jasper, placing her palm on his cheek and staring into his eyes. "You're not him," she whispered. "You're a good man. Never forget that." He nodded slightly, leaning his head into her hand and closing his eyes, as he struggled to hold back his emotions, everyone's emotions. He slowly opened his eyes, leaning down until his forehead rested on hers. "Will you be okay?" she breathed. "Yes," he whispered, before lifting his head and gesturing that she should go with us. She leaned up on her toes, to press her lips to his, before turning to me. With one final nod to Carlyle, I began running back to the house with Bella in my arms. Carlyle, Esme, and Alice followed closely behind. I could feel the tension lessen with each step, each mile of distance we put between us and the battlefield. Carlyle dashed past me as we stepped over the threshold into the house. I sat Bella down on her feet, and she wavered slightly, still overcome by the day's events. A moment later, Carlyle appeared at the bottom of the stairs with a black bag tucked under his arm. "I'm coming with you," Bella asserted, taking a step toward Carlyle. "Bella, you can't," Alice interjected. Bella stared at Alice for a moment. "Why not?" "Because your father hasn't reappeared yet, and if you want to maintain your alibi, you need to wait until he leaves Billy's house." "I don't care." She shook her head. "Jacob needs me." Bella crossed her arms and looked pleadingly to me. "Alice is right," I whispered, reaching out to touch her shoulder, but she shirked away from me. I looked to Carlyle, feeling utterly helpless. I understood that Bella wanted to be there for Jacob, that she felt the need to comfort him. "I could use your help, Edward," Carlyle thought. "You could listen to Jacob's mind, relay his level of pain, give me a more accurate picture of how he's coping with his injuries." I nodded, turning to Bella. I reached out, grasping her chin between my fingers and coaxing her to look up at me. "Please, Bella, stay here with Alice and Esme. I will go with Carlyle, and I'll call you the moment Charlie leaves." She furrowed her brow, uneasy with the thought of sending me to Jacob in her stead. "I'll watch over him for you," I promised, managing a small smile. "I owe him that much." She exhaled and nodded, conceding defeat. I stared intently into her eyes, making absolutely certain that she understood the sincerity of my words. I couldn't harm Jacob. I would never hurt her like that. "Edward." Carlyle broke the silence. "We need to go." I nodded, kissing Bella swiftly on the lips, before following Carlyle into the garage. He had already run past me, the engine of the Mercedes roaring to life as I climbed into the car. Before my door was shut completely, the car jolted forward onto the damp asphalt in a direction it rarely took. We drove in relative silence, if you could consider the discordant stream of thoughts coming from Carlyle's mind to be silent. He was deeply concerned for Jacob's welfare, but his thoughts were overshadowed by a deep-rooted fear about crossing the invisible boundary line into the Quileutes' territory. He had held steadfast to the treaty he had forged with Ephraim for so long that he was struggling with the creation of this new, perhaps temporary understanding with the wolf pack. I watched from the corner of my eye, his body tensing as we crossed the line into the pack's territory. He glanced warily in my direction, and I smiled reassuringly. He blew out a slow breath as we rounded the corner, the first houses of La Push approaching in the distance. The scent of the wolves permeated the air. Before long, the thoughts of the pack began to filter into my mind, and I was surprised to find that Jacob's screams could be heard from such a distance. I grimaced as I listened to his excruciating tirade. I was grateful that Bella had remained at the house. She didn't need to hear this, to endure his pain. The tires screeched to a halt as Carlyle parked the Mercedes in front of the Blacks' home. Sam and Paul waited in the doorway, watching cautiously as we rose from the car. Carlyle reached into the back seat, taking hold of his medical bag, before beginning to close the short distance to the house. In the split second it took him to step out of the car, I watched in fascination as his entire demeanor changed. He was no longer the vampire, the patriarch defending his family. No, in that instant, he was a doctor, the concerned town physician intent on treating an injured patient. To the untrained eye, the shift was subtle, almost imperceptible, but I could see his change in stature, the shift of his demeanor, the way he slowed his movements to appear more human. He was truly skilled in the art of concealment. I could only hope that in 300 years' time I would be just as comfortable, seamlessly transforming from one persona to the next. Sam's face was taut as he watched us approach. He was struggling with this new arrangement nearly as badly as Carlyle. Trust was something they were not accustomed to harboring when it came to our kind, and even after battling together, he was still wary of our presence. "How is he?" Carlyle asked in a timid voice. "How do you think?" Paul sneered, as another scream from Jacob seemed to answer Carlyle's question. "Paul," Sam reproved, glaring at his packmate. "We're glad you're here, Dr. Cullen. Aren't we, Paul?" "Yes," Paul nodded grudgingly. Sam moved aside for us to enter the house, but Paul hesitated for a moment until Sam's glower forced him to relent. The small house was full to the brim, every corner filled with concerned faces. I briefly locked eyes with Charlie, who stood off in the side next to Sue Clearwater, seemingly out of place. He smiled weakly at me, his thoughts clouded in concern for what he considered to be the closest thing he had to a son. "Where is he?" Carlyle asked. Embry stepped forward, ushering us back to a small room, which I presumed to be Jacob's bedroom. Billy sat at Jacob's side, watching helplessly as his son writhed in agony. Jacob's face was contorted in pain. A sheen of perspiration covered his bare skin. His pallor was alarming, a stark contrast to his normally deep, russet skin. Billy lifted his eyes as we walked into the room, and relief washed over him. "Thank God he's here," he thought. Carlyle wasted no time in going to Jacob's side and beginning his assessment. "I'm going to need your help," he thought, glancing briefly in my direction. I walked to the foot of the bed, listening intently to Jacob's thoughts, ready to give Carlyle any information he needed. I flinched as I linked minds with Jacob's, sharing his pain once more. I turned slightly as I heard Seth's thoughts behind me. He stood, leaning against the doorway. He smiled feebly when our eyes met. Since arriving, I had gathered bits and pieces of what had occurred after Jacob was carried from the battlefield, but Seth began to show me in his thoughts everything he had seen. The pack, in their human forms, had carried Jacob from the field as carefully as they could. They were midway to the house when Seth caught up with them. Jacob howled and groaned in pain as they carried him through the forest. All the while, Sam was speaking evenly to him, attempting to calm him enough so that they could get him back into his human form. Seth relayed the looks on the faces of Billy, Sue, and Charlie when they walked through the door. Seth, followed by Leah, Quill, Embry, and Sam, crowded into the tiny front room and stood aside as Paul and Jared carried Jacob into the bedroom without pause. Billy was frantic with worry, and the pack moved aside so Charlie could wheel Billy into Jacob's room to see his son. Seth recalled the tense silence that fell over the house as they waited for Carlyle to arrive, and the relief they felt when we finally appeared. "It's as I feared," Carlyle thought, pursing his lips. "The bones have already begun to fuse, and they are not aligned properly. I have no choice but to re-break them and set them properly." I turned to Jacob's father. "Billy, perhaps it would be best if you stepped outside." His eyes widened, and he sucked in a shallow breath. Carlyle stood and hesitated before placing a calming hand on Billy's shoulder. "His right arm and right leg are broken. It will take some time for me to set his fractures, and I would like to give him some morphine for the pain, if that's acceptable to you." "Anything you need to do," Billy said weakly. "Seth," I said, gesturing to Billy. He nodded in understanding, and immediately moved behind Billy to wheel him into the next room. "Don't worry, sir. Jacob is in good hands," I assured Billy as he rolled past me. "Thank you," he whispered, as he reached out and grasped my hand. I was surprised by the sudden contact, and more surprised that Billy's countenance didn't change when we touched. Regardless of our nature, he seemed genuinely grateful that we were there to help his son. I nodded and shut the door behind them as they left. "Jacob, can you hear me?" Carlyle asked, as he pulled the blankets away that were covering Jacob, so that he had room to work. Jacob nodded feebly as he struggled to focus on Carlyle's words. "Jacob, due to your accelerated healing, the bones have already begun to fuse back together, but they are not aligned properly. I have no choice but to re-break them in order to set them correctly. I'm going to give you some morphine for the pain. You don't have to speak. If you feel pain, Edward will hear it in your thoughts." Jacob squinted against the harsh light, his eyes reaching mine for the briefest moment, and he nodded before slumping back against his pillow. He flinched at the cool touch of Carlyle's hands as he placed the IV into his left arm. Then Carlyle began filling the syringe with the dose of morphine and carefully administered the drug to Jacob. "This is where I'll need your help, Edward," he thought. "Keep a close watch on his level of pain. I'm not certain how much morphine he'll need." I knelt beside Jacob's bed and listened to his thoughts as Carlyle began pulling braces, tapes, and bandages out of his bag to set Jacob's fractures. I could feel the pain lessening in Jacob's mind, but the decrease in his level of pain was grossly disproportionate to the amount of morphine he had been given. "Carlyle, you're going to need to give him a higher dose. With his elevated body temperature, he's going to burn off the morphine more quickly than a human." Carlyle pursed his lips and thought for a moment. "It would be best if he were unconscious for the procedure." "It would be my pleasure." I smiled wryly as I cracked my knuckles. Carlyle shot me a disapproving look, but otherwise ignored my brief attempt at levity. "I'm going to up the dosage, but I need you to tell me the moment he begins to waken or feel any pain." "Of course," I nodded, watching as Carlyle prepared to administer another heavy dose of morphine, perhaps the same dosage he gave to Emmett. Jacob's movements slowly began to still, and his eyelids drooped until his body gave over to the sedative effects of the drug. I nodded to Carlyle, indicating that Jacob was indeed unconscious, and it was okay for him to proceed. Carlyle was visibly nervous as he began to work. Unlike with his human patients, he worked more swiftly, as he endeavored to finish his work before the effects of the morphine could wear off again. I reached over and grasped Jacob's left hand in mine, hoping that even in his unconscious state, he could still be comforted knowing that he was not alone. I flinched at the snapping sound as Carlyle proceeded to break Jacob's bones, rushing not only against the fast-burning morphine, but against Jacob's own rapid healing. Carlyle quickly set each break with a temporary brace. He heals much too quickly for plaster. Braces and bandages. Much more practical, he thought as he worked. I watched as Jacob's unconscious mind began to dream. Much like his dreams in the tent, Bella took center stage in his thoughts. But this dream was unlike the others. They were standing on a beach, hands clasped together. He reached up as a silent tear cascaded down her cheek. "I love you," she whispered. "I know," he smiled. "But you're not mine." The next instant, an image of me appeared on her other side, reaching out for her. She grasped my hand, but refused to let go of Jacob's. "Bella, come," my image urged her. "But I can't leave him," she murmured. "He's my best friend." "You don't have to choose," Jacob encouraged her. "I love you enough not to make you choose. I'll always be here for you." The world of the dream slowly began to melt away. Brilliant red light began to invade where the images of the dream once were. "Carlyle," I whispered urgently, "the morphine is beginning to wear off." Carlyle sighed, shaking his head, and proceeded to administer yet another dose. "I'm almost finished, but I think it would be beneficial to his healing if he remained sedate, at least for a short while." I nodded, and continued to watch Jacob's face for any signs of distress. He looked almost peaceful in his unconscious state, not at all how he normally appeared to me. I wondered to myself if his dreams were indicative of his true feelings, if he would be willing to accept me, to accept Bella's choice. I had made it known on more than one occasion that I loved Bella enough to allow her to choose her own path in life, that I loved her too much to force her to choose between her two loves. For all our differences, our love for Bella was the one shared commonality between us. Perhaps it would unite us in friendship. I smiled to myself at the unlikely turn of events, finding it difficult to imagine that this boy I had for so long considered my enemy could become a friend. Only time would tell, but it was comforting to know that he was finally realizing that he couldn't force her into a decision, that it wasn't fair for her. The sheet fluttered in the air, again covering Jacob's bare skin. "There." Carlyle smiled as he straightened up and began returning the equipment to his bag. "Edward, why don't you tell his father that he can come in now?" I nodded and rose, reaching for the door. I had been so focused on Jacob that I hadn't thought to listen to the thoughts of the pack just outside of the door. A collective gasp sounded as the door opened, and I peered out of the small room. The tension was palpable, and all eyes were on me as I emerged. "Mr. Black, you can see your son now." He took a deep breath, and looked to Charlie, who jumped up from his seat and began wheeling Billy back through the small hallway to Jacob's room. I resumed my seat on the other side of Jacob's bed, continuing to listen for indication of pain, and watched as Billy came in to sit beside his son. Charlie stood off to the side, with his hands awkwardly shoved in his pockets. Billy reached beneath the sheet and found Jacob's hand, clasping it in his own. He squeezed his eyes shut, and a silent tear slid down his cheek. He looked up as Carlyle handed a handkerchief to him, and smiled in thanks. "Your son is going to be just fine," Carlyle assured him. Billy reached out, offering his hand in gratitude. Carlyle was taken aback, but smiled warmly and reached out to shake Billy's hand. "Thank you so much," Billy said. "Thank you." "My pleasure," Carlyle smiled. "It would be to Jacob's benefit not to move him. I will be more than happy to return to ensure he is healing properly." "Thank you," Billy whispered, his voice wavering as he turned back to his son. "I'm going to explain to Sam," Carlyle thought, as he began walking toward the door. "I need for Sam to allow me to continue to treat Jacob until he is completely healed, and forbid Jacob from phasing until I am sure the bones have completely set." I nodded as he disappeared from sight, and returned my attention to Jacob. Charlie moved to Billy's side, placing a warm hand on his shoulder and gripping it tightly. His eyes flickered to mine briefly, and he managed a small smile. "Impressive. I assumed Edward and Jacob hated each other, but Edward looks like he lost a brother. Maybe he's not such a bad guy. Even Jake seems to think so." I saw a brief memory in Charlie's mind of Jacob saying, Bet you're glad she loves Cullen instead of me today, huh, Charlie? It wasn't long before Charlie's natural instincts began to kick in, shifting from concerned friend to dutiful police chief. No scratches, no road rash. It doesn't add up. I wondered to myself if the wolves had even considered fabricating evidence of the crash to corroborate their story. I made a mental note to do just that, in the event that Chief Swan decided to investigate, although I wondered if he would choose to ignore the falsehood, as he often did with Bella. He seemed more comfortable accepting her stories and living in ignorant bliss than struggling to deal with the truth that he wasn't willing to face. Time passed at an excruciatingly slow pace, Carlyle entering the room at regular intervals to check Jacob's vital signs and administer more pain medication. Before long, Charlie began checking his watch and excused himself, explaining to Billy that Bella was due to arrive home in a short while and he wanted to be there to break the news of Jacob's misfortune to her. The moment his car pulled away, I retrieved my phone and began to dial. Bella picked up on the first ring. "Edward?" she breathed. "Your father's gone now," I said. "It's safe for you to come and see him." "Is he—" "He's going to be fine, Bella. You don't have much time." "I'm on my way." I closed the phone and returned it to my pocket. Before much time at all had passed, I could hear Bella's truck rumbling to a stop outside the house. Her heart was beating fast, and I listened as she jogged into the house and straight to Jacob's bedroom. I looked up to see her standing in the doorway, frozen on the spot. Her eyes grew wide as she took in the scene, and her breathing hitched. Carlyle walked up behind her and placed a comforting arm around her shoulders. She slumped against him, and he squeezed her reassuringly. "He's going to be fine, Bella. It looks worse than it is. He's healing very quickly, much too quickly for plaster. He'll be back to himself in no time." Carlyle smiled. I lifted a hand, gesturing for Bella to come to Jacob's side. She hesitated, pausing to wrap her arms around Billy's neck. He reached up, patting her back softly as a tear slid down her cheek. She walked around the bed, and I pulled her onto my lap, wrapping an arm around her and kissing her lightly on the forehead. She reached out, taking Jacob's hand in hers, and ran her thumb lightly over his knuckles. Another tear slid down her cheek, and I reached up to wipe it away with the back of my hand. She smiled weakly and reached for my hand. She held my hand in her left and Jacob's in her right, her two loves, connected in a way that, as unusual as it may be, just seemed right. She loved us both, and there was no reason why she should have to choose. If she kept her word and married me, there was no reason why Jacob couldn't still be a part of her life, as long as he was just as willing to accept the decision she made. I was struck by the glaring similarities to Jacob's dream, but watching her in this moment, seeing the grief on her face, I couldn't help but wonder if she was making the wrong decision. He could give her so much that I couldn't. I loved her with every fiber of my being. There was no denying that. But there was a part of me that struggled with her feelings for him. Perhaps it was the jealousy rearing its ugly head again, but there was a small part of me that envied the way she looked at him, and another small part wondered if it would be better if I let her go. My heart broke at the thought, and I couldn't imagine that I would even be able to give her up. But what if that was the right thing to do? She so clearly loved Jacob, and he was so right for her in ways that I could never be. Who was I to deny her that relationship? But I wouldn't make that mistake again. I wouldn't choose for her. We sat in silence, and I watched helplessly as an endless supply of tears quietly flowed from her eyes. A moment later, the phone in my pocket began to vibrate, and I brought it to my ear. "Edward," Alice said, "it's time for Bella to leave." I cast a furtive glance to Bella. Her brow furrowed as she tried to determine who I was speaking to. "Alice," I mouthed. She shook her head and rolled her eyes, turning her attention back to Jacob. "She just got here, Alice," I whispered.
"It doesn't matter. Charlie will be expecting her soon, and we need to keep her alibi intact. I've already acquired all the evidence she'll need, but she needs to collect it and go home before Charlie can become suspicious."
I nodded, squeezing Bella's hand. "I'll tell her," I muttered, before closing the phone. Bella looked up to me, her eyes wary. She knew why Alice was calling, and although I knew Bella needed to be here for her friend, she also needed to keep up the pretenses for her father's sake. Now was not the time to get sloppy and tip him off to the fact that she had been less than honest about her activities this week. "Alice said it's time for you to go," I whispered. She pulled her bottom lip between her teeth, as though she was fighting the urge to argue, but she nodded in surrender, resigned to the fact that she had no choice in the matter. As much as it pained her to leave her friend, she realized that it was a necessary sacrifice. She lifted Jacob's hand to her lips, placing a soft kiss on his knuckles before laying his hand back down on the bed. I fought to control my emotions. I felt like I was an outsider intruding on a tender moment, like I didn't belong. "I'll be back," Bella whispered before standing to leave. I stood with her and wrapped an arm around her as I ushered her toward the door. She hesitated, looking back at Jacob's sleeping form. What I wouldn't give to see inside of her mind at this moment. I'd often wondered if it was a cruel twist of fate that I would fall in love with the one mind in the world that was silent to me. She walked slowly, struggling with each step, and she smiled faintly at the pack members who were still waiting in the front room of Billy's house. I walked with her outside. A light mist rained down, covering us in a sheen of tiny water droplets. I reached for the door handle and opened the driver's side door for her. Bella reached in front of her, bracing her hands on either side of the door's opening, and slumped slightly. Her knuckles were white as she gripped the door frame, and her body shuddered as a whimper escaped her lips. I wrapped my arms around her waist, pulling her to my chest, and placing a kiss at the nape of her neck. She sank into my embrace, and I held her as she sobbed quietly. "He's going to be fine," I assured her.
"I know,"
she murmured softly.
"It's just—"
"I understand," I whispered. We stood like that for another moment as she regained her composure. She climbed into the truck, and I closed the door as she pulled the seat belt across her waist. She slumped back into the seat and gripped the steering wheel with both hands. "Can you drive?" I asked, concerned about her navigating the wet roads in her emotional state.
"I'll be fine,"
she whispered. I reached into the open window, raking my knuckles across her damp cheek. Her eyes fluttered closed, and she leaned into my touch. "I'll watch over him," I promised. She nodded once more before starting the engine. She smiled softly, and I removed my hand as she pulled the truck into gear and began driving away. I stood in the rain, watching the gleam of her taillights disappear in the distance. Was she making the right decision? Was I making the right decision not to interfere? I ran my fingers through my unruly hair, pushing my thoughts aside. There would be time to sort all of that out later.